The scent of rosemary roasted lamb and expensive lavender polish usually signalled a victory for Margaret. At 64, she had mastered the art of the maternal gala, a high-stakes performance of domestic perfection designed to remind her son, Julian, and his wife, Chloe, exactly where the centre of their universe sat. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe now to support me and motivate me to make more such videos. Do let me know in the comments of where you're watching from. Margaret smoothed the linen runner on the mahogany table, her fingers tracing the intricate embroidery. Everything was ready. The mimosas were chilled to a precise degree, the heirloom crystal caught the morning sun in a way that felt like a blessing, and the Mother's Day cards, 2 of them, sat unopened by her plate like small paper trophies. Julian, Chloe, the soufflé won't wait for the gossip to finish, Margaret called out, her voice a practiced melody of warmth and command. She heard the muffled sound of footsteps in the hallway. They had been staying in the East Wing, a generous term for the renovated guest suite attached to the main house, for 2 years now. Ever since Julian's digital wellness startup had folded, and Chloe's career as a lifestyle influencer had hit a plateau that required, as Chloe put it, significant capital for rebranding. Margaret stepped into the kitchen to grab the silver tongs, but stopped short when she heard Chloe's voice drifting through the cracked pantry door. It wasn't the sweet, performative lilt Chloe used when asking for a bridge loan. It was sharp, jagged, and dripping with a strange, frantic vitriol. "I'm telling you, I can't breathe in here, Sarah," Chloe hissed. Margaret froze, the tongs cold in her hand. The air is literally thick with her expectations. We had to spend 3 hours yesterday picking out a meaningful gift just so she wouldn't have a meltdown. There was a pause, presumably as the person on the other end of the FaceTime call responded. "No, it's worse," Chloe continued, a mocking giggle bubbling up. "She's the ultimate gatekeeper. The Shrew of Shoreline Drive. She sits on that pile of Arthur's money like a dragon, making us dance for every cent of our allowance. Every brunch is a hostage negotiation. If I have to hear one more story about how she built this empire from a shoebox, I'm going to scream into the hollandaise." Margaret felt a sudden, violent chill. The word shrew didn't just hurt. It vibrated in her chest like a struck tuning fork. The shrew. She looked down at her hands. They were the hands that had typed Arthur's legal briefs until 3 a.m. in a cramped studio apartment 40 years ago. They were the hands that had signed the checks for Julian's Ivy League tuition, his wedding in Tuscany, and the very phone Chloe was currently using to disparage her. "She's so oblivious," Chloe's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "She thinks she's the benevolent matriarch. She doesn't realize we're just counting down the days until the trust settles. Until then, we just have to keep the shrew fed and happy." The sound of Julian's voice joined in, not in defense, but in a low, placating mumble. "Honey, keep it down. She's right through the door." "She can't hear anything over the sound of her own ego, Jules," Chloe snapped. Margaret stood paralyzed in the pantry. The sensory richness of the morning, the smell of the lamb, the warmth of the sun, suddenly felt like a cruel joke. She wasn't a mother being celebrated. She was an ATM with a pulse, a hurdle to be cleared. "I am the shrew," she thought, her internal voice turning dangerously quiet. "I am the dragon on the pile of gold." She looked at the silver tongs. She looked at the $400 bottle of champagne. Then she looked at the heavy, gold-embossed leather binder on her desk in the corner of the kitchen, the one containing the ledger for the family liquidity account. A slow, cold heat began to spread from her stomach to her limbs. For years, she had felt a nagging guilt for wanting to be thanked, for wanting her son to be a man of his own making. She had suppressed the shrewish urge to demand accountability because she feared losing them. But the fear was gone now. It had been incinerated by a FaceTime call. "Mother? Are you in there?" Julian's voice called out from the dining room. "The table looks amazing. We have your gift." Margaret took a long, steadying breath. She caught her reflection in the polished surface of a silver platter. Her face didn't look like a Shrew's. It looked like a CEO's. She walked out into the dining room with a smile so perfect, it was terrifying. "Happy Mother's Day, darlings," Margaret said, her voice like silk over a blade. She didn't sit down. She didn't look at the gift bag Chloe was holding out with a practiced sugary grin. "You know," Margaret said, picking up her mimosa and taking a slow, deliberate sip. "I've been thinking about what you said, Chloe, about the air being thick in this house, and I think I have a solution that will help us all breathe much, much easier." Chloe's smile faltered, her eyes darting to Julian. "Oh? What's that, Margaret?" Margaret set the glass down with a sharp clack against the mahogany. "I've decided to give you exactly what you want. Total independence." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her cell phone, her thumb hovering over the banking app that controlled the flow of every dollar the couple spent. "Wait, Mom, what are you doing?" Julian asked, his brow furrowing as he noticed the coldness in her eyes. "I'm updating the security protocols," Margaret whispered, her thumb descending toward the screen. "Starting with the access codes for the trust." The silence that followed Margaret's announcement was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, like the air in a room just before a storm breaks. Julian laughed, a nervous hacking sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom, you're being dramatic. It's Mother's Day. Let's just sit down, eat this incredible lamb, and talk about—" "The lamb is overcooked, Julian," Margaret interrupted. Her voice was a flat line. "And I'm tired of talking. Talking is what we've done for 3 years while you disrupted industries that didn't need disrupting and Chloe curated a life she couldn't afford. Today we're doing math instead." She didn't wait for a rebuttal. Margaret turned on her heel and marched toward her study, the heels of her Ferragamo pumps clicking like a metronome against the hardwood. Behind her, she heard the frantic scuffle of chairs and the hissed whispers of her children. "Margaret, wait!" Chloe's voice was back to its honey-thick performative tone, but there was a jagged edge of panic beneath it. The study was a sanctuary of dark oak and old paper. On the desk sat the heavy gold-embossed leather binder, the family trust ledger. Margaret snapped the brass desk lamp on, the sudden pool of light illuminating the rows of figures that represented her life's work. Or, more accurately, the slow bleeding of it. Julian and Chloe crowded into the doorway. They looked absurd in their brunch finery, Julian in his pastel linen shirt, Chloe in a floral silk dress that Margaret had paid for as a cheer-up gift last month. "Look at this," Margaret said, her finger hovering over a line item. "March 14th, $4,000 for brand development. March 22nd, $2,000 for a networking retreat in Aspen. April 5th, $3,000 for essential aesthetics." "Tell me, Chloe, which part of my husband's estate is considered essential aesthetics?" Chloe flushed a deep, blotchy crimson. That's private business, Margaret. You can't just audit our lives like we're subordinates." "You are subordinates," Margaret snapped, the word landing like a physical blow. "You live in my house. You drive cars registered to my holding company. You eat food purchased on a black card that draws directly from the account my husband bled for. If you were employees, I would have fired you for embezzlement years ago." The shrew, Margaret thought, the word echoing in her mind. If I am the shrew, then I shall be the most meticulous shrew they have ever encountered. Julian stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mom? Okay, we get it. We've been a little loose with the spending. But we're family. You're talking about Arthur's legacy. He wanted us taken care of." Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. She saw the soft lines of a man who had never had to worry about a utility bill, the polished skin of a man who had never broken a sweat for a paycheck. "Your father," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "once walked 3 miles in a snowstorm to save $5 on a filing fee because we needed that $5 for your formula, Julian. He didn't build this legacy so you could use it as a safety net for your laziness. He built it to be a springboard. But you've turned it into a hammock." She opened the banking portal on her desktop monitor. The blue light reflected in her glasses, making her eyes look like cold, glowing embers. "What are you doing?" Chloe asked, stepping closer to the desk, her breath hitching. "Margaret, don't be rash. I have a campaign launching tomorrow. The deposit for the photographer is supposed to clear at midnight." "Then I suggest you find a very generous photographer," Margaret said. She navigated to the Account Permissions tab. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird, but her hand was steady. She felt a strange, intoxicating rush of clarity. For years she had felt like a servant to their needs, terrified that if she closed the tap, they would vanish. Now, she realized that the tap was the only thing keeping them here, and it was a tether that was strangling her. "Log out of all devices?" the prompt asked. "Yes." "Change primary access code?" "Yes." "Margaret, stop!" Chloe lunged toward the mouse, but Margaret caught her wrist with a strength that surprised both of them. "Do not touch my desk," Margaret hissed. "You called me a dragon, Chloe. You said I make you dance for every cent." "Well, the music just stopped." Margaret typed in a new, complex 20-character password, one they would never guess. It was the date of her and Arthur's first wedding anniversary, followed by the coordinates of the first office they had rented. A history they didn't know and didn't care about. "There," Margaret said, leaning back as the screen refreshed. "Access denied." The room went silent. In the kitchen, the timer for the souffle went off, a shrill, mocking beep that cut through the tension. "You didn't," Julian whispered, staring at the screen. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb swiping frantically. "My Apple Pay. It's saying account suspended." "Mum, I can't even buy gas to get back to the city." "The guest house has a full pantry," Margaret said, closing the leather binder with a definitive thud. "And I believe there are 2 bicycles in the garage. Use them. It's a lovely day for a ride." Chloe was shaking, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You think this is a game? You're going to leave us with nothing? Over a few words? You really are a shrew. You're a bitter, lonely old woman who uses money because nobody would stay with you for your personality." Margaret felt the sting, but it was distant, like a needle prick through layers of heavy wool. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but I am a bitter, lonely woman with a very large, very locked vault. And you? You are currently a trespasser in a floral dress." Julian looked between his wife and his mother, his face pale. "Mom, please, just give us a week to figure things out. You can't just cut us off in the middle of a Sunday." "I can," Margaret said, "and I have. In fact, I've done more than just lock the liquid accounts." She stood up, smoothing her skirt, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that felt like granite. "I called Mr. Henderson at the bank on my way into the study," she lied, though she would make the call the second they left the room. "The family trust isn't just paused, Julian. It's being restructured. Every penny is being moved into a locked-in 5-year CD. It won't even be visible on your portal anymore." Chloe let out a strangled cry of frustration. 5 years? We'll be bankrupt in 5 days. "Then I suggest you start updating your resumes," Margaret said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go eat my brunch. Alone. I find the company of the Shrew much more agreeable than yours." She walked past them, her shoulder brushing Julian's. She headed back to the dining room, sat at the head of the table and carved a slice of the lamb. It was cold. It was dry. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She heard them retreating to the guest suite, their voices rising in a panicked duet of blame and terror. Margaret took a sip of her mimosa, staring out at the rolling green lawn. Suddenly her phone buzzed on the table. It wasn't a text from Julian. It was an automated alert from her security system. "Front gate, vehicle entering. Authorized user, Arthur Miller Jr." Margaret froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Arthur Jr., her eldest son. The one who had vanished 5 years ago after a bitter falling out over the estate. the one she hadn't spoken to since his father's funeral. The gate was opening, and for the first time in an hour, Margaret's composure shattered. The silver fork clattered against the fine bone china, the sound ringing through the vaulted dining room like a gunshot. Margaret's heart, which had been a cold, steady stone moments ago, now thrashed in her chest. Arthur Jr. She watched the security monitor on the sideboard, a dusty charcoal grey SUV rolled up the long gravel driveway, kicking up plumes of white dust that settled on the manicured boxwood hedges. This wasn't the flashy red Italian sports car he'd driven when he left. This was a tank, utilitarian, bruised, and carrying the one person capable of dismantling her newfound resolve. "Mom, who the hell is that?" Julian asked, stumbling back into the dining room. His face was puffy from the heat of his argument with Chloe, but his eyes were wide with a different kind of fear. Margaret didn't answer. She rose, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She walked to the grand front doors, her reflection in the hallway mirrors, ghost-like and pale. She pulled the heavy oak door open, just as the SUV's engine died with a mechanical wheeze. The man who stepped out was a weathered version of the boy she remembered. Arthur Jr. was 40 now, his hair thinning at the temples, wearing a flannel shirt that looked like it had seen better days. He didn't look like a man coming to claim an inheritance. He looked like a man coming home from a war. "Mother," he said, standing at the base of the stone steps. He didn't move to hug her. The air between them was thick with 5 years of unsaid apologies and jagged silences. "Artie?" Julian pushed past Margaret, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here? Did she call you? Did the Shrew call in reinforcements?" Arthur Jr.'s eyes flicked to Julian, then back to Margaret. A shadow of a grimace crossed his face. "I see some things haven't changed. You're still whining, and the house still smells like lavender and resentment." "You have a lot of nerve showing up today," Chloe shouted from the top of the stairs, her voice shrill. "We're in the middle of a family crisis. Margaret has lost her mind. She's frozen everything." Arthur Jr. took a slow step up the stairs, ignoring Chloe entirely. He stopped a foot away from Margaret. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, lines that hadn't been there when he stormed out of his father's funeral. "I didn't come for the money, Julian," Arthur Jr. said, his voice a low rumble. "I came because I got a notification on the old server, the one Dad set up for the in case of emergency protocols. The primary accounts were locked today. That only happens if the estate is under threat, or if the person holding the keys is done being a martyr." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. Arthur had always been the perceptive one, the one who took after his father's mind, while Julian had inherited only his father's charm. "I'm done, Artie," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. "I heard them. I heard what they think of me." Arthur Jr. looked at the luxury cars in the driveway, then at the desperate, sweating faces of Julian and Chloe. A slow, dark smile spread across his face, a look that mirrored Margaret's expression from the study. "Good for you, Mom," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered manila envelope. "Because if you're finally cutting the cord, you're going to need to see what I found. I didn't leave 5 years ago because of the money, Mother. I left because I found out what Julian was doing to Dad's offshore holdings before the body was even cold." Julian's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent white. "Artie, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about." "I have the signatures, Jules," Arthur Jr. said, tapping the envelope against his palm. He looked at Margaret, his expression softening into something like pity. "You didn't just freeze their savings today, Mom. You accidentally tripped a wire on a 5-year-old embezzlement scheme." Margaret felt the world tilt. She reached out to the doorframe to steady herself. "What are you talking about? The trust." The trust was intact. "On paper, maybe," Arthur Jr. said, stepping into the foyer and past his brother. "But we need to go to the study, now. Because the bank isn't just going to freeze these accounts, Margaret. Once they see the discrepancy I just flagged, they're going to call the police." The sound of a distant siren began to wail, growing louder as it echoed up the winding road of Shoreline Drive. The siren's wail was no longer a distant ghost. It was a physical weight, pressing against the leaded glass windows of the foyer until the panes seemed to shiver. Blue and red lights began to pulse against the white marble floor, rhythmic like a heartbeat under stress. Margaret didn't move. She watched Julian. Her youngest, her baby, the boy who had once cried over a scraped knee, was now a man whose skin appeared to be melting off his bones. He was trembling so violently that the ice in the forgotten mimosa glass he still clutched began to rattle against the crystal. "Julian?" Margaret whispered, the name feeling like ash in her mouth. "Tell me he's lying." "Mum, Artie is... He's always hated me," Julian stammered, his voice climbing an octave. "He's trying to take advantage of the fact that you're angry. He's twisting things." Arthur Jr. didn't argue. He simply walked into the study, the heavy manila envelope tucked under his arm like a whetted blade. He sat behind the mahogany desk, Arthur Sr.'s desk, and spread the papers out under the pool of the brass lamp. "Come look, Mother," Artie said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Don't look at me. Look at the ink." Margaret walked into the room, her movements mechanical. She ignored Chloe, who was leaning against the doorframe, hyperventilating into her manicured hands. Margaret looked down at the documents. They were wire transfer authorizations from the months following her husband's death. The amounts were jagged, $15,000 here, $22,000 there, funneled into a shell corporation registered in Delaware. At the bottom of each page was a signature. Arthur Miller Sr. Margaret's breath hitched. That's your father's hand. But these dates... Arthur had been gone for weeks when these were signed. "It's a digital forgery, Mom," Artie said, pointing to a slight pixelation on the serif of the M. "A damn good one. Jules used the old scanner in the basement. He didn't think anyone would look because the Shrew was too busy grieving to check the subledger." Margaret turned to Julian, who had followed them into the room, his shadow looming large and distorted against the bookshelves. "You forged your father's name while I was picking out his casket, while I was sitting in that chapel wondering how I would breathe without him." "We were drowning, Mom," Julian suddenly exploded, his fear turning into a defensive snarl. "The startup was hemorrhaging cash. I thought I could pay it back before the quarterly audit. I was just borrowing from my own future." "It wasn't your future," Margaret roared, the sound tearing from her throat with such force that Julian flinched. "It was our survival. I spent 5 years thinking I was being the shrew for asking you to save a penny, while you were stripping the copper from the walls." The front doorbell rang, 3 sharp, authoritative raps. The sound felt final. It was the sound of the world Margaret had built, finally collapsing. Through the sheer curtains of the study window, she saw 2 uniformed officers and a man in a sharp, slate-grey suit. "That's Detective Miller," Artie said, standing up. "No relation. I called him from the road. I told him there was a massive discrepancy in a high-value estate. I didn't give him names yet, Mom. I wanted to give you the chance to decide how this goes." Margaret looked at the door, then back at Julian. Her son was on his knees now, the bravado gone, replaced by a raw, pathetic desperation. "Mom, please," Julian sobbed, reaching for the hem of her skirt. "If they take me, if I go to jail, I'll lose everything. Chloe will leave me. My life is over. Please, just tell them it was an oversight. Tell them you authorized it." Chloe was silent now, her eyes darting between the door and the safe in the corner of the room, her loyalty clearly weighing the cost of a sinking ship. Margaret looked at her son's hands, the hands she had washed, the hands she had held, the hands that had forged a dead man's name to buy influencer campaigns and designer suits. Her mind raced. If she claimed she'd authorized the transfers, she could save him. But she would be complicit in a felony. She would be protecting the man who had mocked her for the very generosity he was stealing. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. "Margaret," Artie said, his hand resting on the phone. "The bank has already flagged the freeze you put on the accounts. The minute the police run the audit, they'll see the fraud. You have exactly 10 seconds to decide if you're his mother or his victim. Margaret looked at the security monitor. The lead detective was leaning into the doorbell camera. Mrs. Miller? The detective's voice boomed through the intercom. We have a report of suspicious financial activity at this address. Please open the door. Margaret reached out and gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. She looked at Julian, then at the empty chair where her husband used to sit. Artie, she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. Open the door. Mom, no! Julian shrieked. Artie walked toward the foyer, but Margaret stayed in the study. She picked up the phone on the desk and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Henderson, she said when the banker picked up. This is Margaret Miller. About that CD I wanted to open. Cancel it. I need you to prepare a full, unredacted history of the Delaware transfers. And Henderson? Send it directly to the district attorney's office. She hung up and walked toward the foyer just as the front door swung open. The detective stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Mrs. Miller, he asked, are you all right? Margaret looked at Julian, who was being hauled up by Artie, his face a mask of betrayal. Then she looked at the detective and did something she hadn't done since her husband died. She smiled. A cold, sharp, terrifyingly calm smile. I'm perfectly fine, detective, she said. In fact, I've just finished a very long, overdue spring cleaning. But I believe my son has something he needs to confess to you. Just as Julian opened his mouth to speak, a second car screeched into the driveway, a sleek black sedan with government plates. A woman in a dark suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase that bore the seal of the Internal Revenue Service. Artie's face went pale. Mum, I didn't call them. The arrival of the black sedan turned the frantic energy of the foyer into a vacuum. The IRS investigator, a woman with a face like a flint axe and eyes that seemed to count the cost of the chandelier just by looking at it, stepped over the threshold without waiting for an invitation. I'm Special Agent Vance, she said, her voice cutting through Julian's whimpering like a scalpel. She didn't look at the police officers. She looked directly at Margaret. I'm looking for the treasurer of the Miller Heart Foundation. Our office flagged a series of offshore movements that don't align with your 501c3 status. Margaret felt the floor beneath her shift. The Miller Heart Foundation was her sacred project, the charity she had built to honour Arthur's memory by providing microloans to inner-city entrepreneurs. I am the treasurer, Margaret said, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. But those accounts are separate from our personal holdings. There must be a mistake. There's no mistake, Margaret, Arthur Jr. muttered, his face drained of colour as he stared at the briefcase Agent Vance was opening. The Delaware Shell Company Jules set up. He didn't just fund it with the trust, he linked it to the foundation's tax ID to hide the trail. He was laundering the estate through the charity. Margaret turned to Julian. The air in the foyer was thick with the smell of the rosemary lamb drifting from the dining room, a scent that now nauseated her. The foundation, Julian? You stole from the charity. It was just a pass-through, Julian screamed, his voice breaking into a sob. He turned toward Chloe, who was backing away toward the kitchen, her eyes darting toward the back exit. Chloe, tell them. You said it was a genius move. You said it would make the rebranding tax-deductible. The silence that followed was visceral. Chloe stopped, her hand on the doorframe, her face twisting into a mask of pure icy pragtainment. I don't know what he's talking about, Chloe said, her voice steady and devoid of the honeyed warmth she'd used for years. I'm a consultant. I don't handle the books. If Julian was misappropriating funds, that's a marital issue, not a legal one for me. I was just an employee of the lifestyle brand. An employee, Margaret whispered. I paid for your wedding, Chloe. I paid for the roof over your head this morning. And you made us pay for it with our dignity, Margaret, Chloe snapped, the Shrew finally showing her teeth without a screen to hide behind. If Julian is going down, I'm not going with him. I have a prenup that protects my personal assets. Agent Vance cleared her throat, a dry, papery sound. Actually, Mrs. Miller, if those assets were purchased with diverted charitable funds, they aren't protected. They're evidence. And since you're listed as a creative director on the payroll of a fraudulent shell company, you might want to call your own lawyer. Julian let out a guttural sound, a mix of a laugh and a choke, as he watched his wife's face go from defiant to terrified. The two of them, the golden couple of Margaret's social circle, were being stripped bare in the foyer of the house they had treated like a playground. "Detective," Margaret said, turning to the local officer, "I want them out. Not just out of this house, out of my life. If that means they leave in handcuffs, so be it." "Mom, wait!" Julian lunged forward, but the detective stepped between them, his hand resting firmly on his belt. "Mrs. Miller," Agent Vance said, looking up from a tablet, "before we proceed with the arrests, there's something you need to see. These transfers, they weren't just going to the shell company. There's a secondary recipient, a recurring payment to a medical facility in Switzerland." Margaret frowned. "Switzerland? We don't have any family in Switzerland." "No," Agent Vance said, her eyes softening with a flicker of genuine pity. "But apparently, Arthur Miller Sr. had a separate life insurance policy you didn't know about. And, according to these records, the beneficiary isn't Julian or Arthur Jr. Arthur Jr. stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Then who is it?" Agent Vance turned the tablet around. On the screen was a scanned image of a birth certificate and a trust document, dated 10 years ago. "The beneficiary is a girl named Eleanor," the agent said, "and the guardian listed on the account is Chloe's sister." The room went deathly quiet. Margaret felt as if the walls of the house she had fought so hard to keep, were finally folding in on her. She looked at Chloe, whose eyes were no longer terrified, but wide with a secret that had just been dragged into the light. "You knew?" Margaret whispered to Chloe. Chloe didn't look away. She lifted her chin, a cruel, triumphant glint in her eyes. "I didn't just know, Margaret. I've been the one making sure she was taken care of. Your perfect Arthur wasn't so perfect after all, was he? He was just like Julian. He just had better secrets." Margaret's hand went to the gold locket at her throat, the one containing Arthur's picture. With a sudden, violent jerk, she ripped the chain from her neck and threw it onto the marble floor. "Detective," Margaret said, her voice vibrating with a power that made everyone in the room go still. "Take them all, and find me a lawyer who specializes in scorched earth." As the officers moved toward Julian and Chloe, a loud metallic thud echoed from the driveway. Margaret looked at the security monitor. A second moving truck had arrived, but this one wasn't for Julian. Men in black tactical gear were stepping out, carrying equipment Margaret didn't recognize. "Agent Vance," Margaret said, pointing to the screen. "Who are they?" Vance looked at the monitor and swore under her breath. "That's not us. That's the SEC's asset seizure team. They aren't here for the books, Mrs. Miller. They're here to seize the house." The roar of the SEC's tactical team unloading equipment in the driveway sounded like the beginning of an invasion. Margaret stood at the center of the foyer, the shattered locket at her feet, watching as men in windbreakers emblazoned with federal agent began cordoning off the stone pillars of her porch with yellow tape. "Seize the house?" Margaret's voice was a ghost of itself. "This property was bought in 1994. It has nothing to do with Julian's startups or the Foundation's recent filings." Agent Vance didn't look up from her tablet. "It does if the property was used as collateral for the Delaware loans, Mrs. Miller. Julian didn't just forge signatures on wire transfers. He used the deed to this estate to back a $10 million line of credit. Since those funds were commingled with laundered charitable donations, the entire asset is now considered instrumentality of a crime." "You idiot!" Artie screamed, lunging at Julian. The detectives caught Artie by the arms, dragging him back as Julian curled into a ball on the marble floor, sobbing into his hands. "You put Mum's house on the line for a wellness app? For a brand?" "I was going to pay it back," Julian wailed. "The IPO was supposed to happen in June. I just needed a bridge." The only bridge you're getting is the one you'll be sleeping under. Artie spat. Margaret ignored the chaos. She walked past the shouting men and the sobbing son, straight out the front door. The air outside was crisp, smelling of salt spray from the coast and the gasoline of the idling federal SUVs. She stood on the top step, looking out over the rolling green lawn she had mowed herself when they were too poor for gardeners, and the rose bushes she had planted to celebrate Arthur's first big win. A man in a navy suit with SEC on the lapel approached her, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, you have 2 hours to vacate the premises. You may take personal clothing and essential medications. All furniture, art, and jewellery are under a temporary restraining order." Margaret looked at him, her eyes as cold as the Atlantic. "My husband is buried in the garden of the estate 3 miles down the road. I built this life. You are not taking it because of a boy who hasn't worked a day in his life." "Mom," Artie said, stepping out behind her, his voice low. "Let it go. We have to go to a hotel. I can call a lawyer from there." "No," Margaret said. She turned to Agent Vance, who had followed them out. "You mentioned a medical facility in Switzerland for a girl named Eleanor. If Julian was using the Foundation's money to pay for her care, then that money wasn't just stolen. It was used to maintain a secret my husband kept for a decade." She stepped closer to Vance, her voice dropping to a whisper that didn't reach the ears of the officers. "If I can prove that the collateral Julian used was based on a fraudulent title, that I never signed the spousal waiver because my husband was leading a double life that invalidated our financial disclosures, can I stop the seizure?" Vance paused, her professional mask flickering. "If you can prove the house was encumbered through a series of frauds that predate Julian's latest schemes, you might have a stay of execution, but you'd be admitting that your entire marriage was a legal fiction. If Julian was using the Foundation's money to pay for her care, then that money wasn't just stolen. It was used to maintain a secret my husband kept for a decade." She stepped closer to Vance, her voice dropping to a whisper that didn't reach the ears of the officers. "If I can prove that the collateral Julian used was based on a fraudulent title, that I never signed the spousal waiver because my husband was leading a double life that invalidated our financial disclosures, can I stop the seizure?" Vance paused, her professional mask flickering. "If you can prove the house was encumbered through a series of frauds that predate Julian's latest schemes, you might have a stay of execution, but you'd be admitting that your entire marriage was a legal fiction." Margaret looked at Chloe, who was being led out in handcuffs, her face a mask of smug bitterness. Chloe knew. She had used the secret of Eleanor to keep Julian under her thumb, and Julian had used the estate to keep the secret quiet. "I don't care about the marriage," Margaret said, her voice hardening into something unbreakable. "Arthur is dead. The man I loved didn't exist. But this house, this dirt, this is mine." She turned to Artie. "Go to the basement. Behind the wine cellar there's a safe my father built. Not Arthur, my father. It's not on any floor plan. Inside there's a blue folder labelled Shoreline 1994. Bring it to me." As Artie ran back inside, the SEC agent stepped forward. "Ma'am, the clock is ticking. You need to move." "I'm not moving an inch," Margaret said, sitting down on the top stone step, her back straight as a spear. "And if you want to pull me off this porch, you'll have to do it in front of the local news crew that Chloe surely called an hour ago." Just then, Julian was led out, in zip ties. He looked at his mother, his eyes pleading for one last act of the Shrew's protection. "Mom," he choked out, Tell them I'm your son." Margaret didn't even look at him. She looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip toward the sea. "I don't have a son," she said quietly. "I have a ledger. And it's time to balance the books." Artie emerged from the house, breathless, holding the blue folder, but as he handed it to Margaret, a small laminated card fell out. It wasn't a deed. It was a photo of a young girl with Arthur's eyes, standing in front of a Swiss clinic, holding a sign that read, "Happy Father's Day, Papa." The date on the back of the photo was only 3 months ago. Margaret's heart stopped. Arthur had been dead for 5 years. The laminated photograph felt like a shard of ice in Margaret's palm. She stared at the girl's smile, the unmistakable Miller jawline, the same mischievous glint in the eyes that Arthur Sr. had carried to his grave. But the date on the back, printed in crisp digital ink, was from March of this year. Happy Father's Day, Papa. He's dead, Margaret whispered, the words catching in a throat that felt like it was lined with glass. I watched them lower the casket. I felt the dirt. Mum, what is it? Artie asked, reaching for the photo. As his eyes scanned the image and the date, his face went from a frantic flush to a ghostly, translucent grey. This is impossible. Is this a prank? Did Chloe set this up? Margaret turned her gaze toward the police cruiser where Chloe sat. Through the tinted glass, she could see Chloe watching them. Even in handcuffs, the younger woman didn't look defeated. She looked like someone who had just placed a winning bet. Margaret stormed toward the car, ignoring the SEC agent who tried to intercept her. She tapped hard on the glass until the officer rolled it down. Who is he? Margaret demanded, thrusting the photo at Chloe's face. The date, Chloe. Explain the date. Chloe leaned back against the headrest, a slow, poisonous smirk spreading across her lips. I told you, Margaret. Arthur had better secrets than Julian. He didn't just build an empire, he built a contingency plan. He's dead, Margaret screamed, the composure she had fought so hard to maintain finally snapping. The man you buried is dead, yes, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial purr. But Arthur Miller isn't just a person. It's a signature. It's a series of trusts. And as long as someone is alive to sign the checks in Switzerland, Eleanor gets her care, and the papa she writes to keeps responding. The realization hit Margaret with the force of a physical blow. The forgery Artie had found in the study, the pixelated signatures on the Delaware transfers, weren't just Julian's clumsy attempts to steal. They were part of a larger ongoing heartbeat of a ghost. Julian wasn't the mastermind, Artie said, appearing at Margaret's shoulder, his voice trembling. He was just a parasite feeding off a system someone else was already running. Mum, if someone is still using Dad's identity to move money, then the house, the foundation, the theft, it's all connected to whoever is holding the other end of that Swiss line. Which is why the SEC is here, Agent Vance said, stepping up behind them, her expression grim. We didn't just track Julian's IP, we tracked a login from a secure server in Zurich that accessed your home network last night. Someone was watching you, Mrs. Miller. Someone was watching you freeze those accounts from halfway across the world. Margaret looked at the house, the gilded cage she had spent 40 years decorating. It suddenly felt like a hollow stage set. Every piece of furniture, every polished silver spoon was bought with the permission of a ghost who was still presiding over her life. Wait, Julian's voice drifted from the other police car. He was staring at the photo in Artie's hand. That's not Dad's daughter. Margaret turned to her youngest son. What do you mean? I saw that girl once, Julian stammered, his bravado completely extinguished. 4 years ago at a hotel in Geneva. I thought she was a cousin or something. But she wasn't with Dad. He was already gone. Who was she with, Julian? Margaret moved toward him, her shadow long and sharp in the twilight. Tell me the truth for once in your miserable life. Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the charcoal-grey SUV Artie had driven up in. She was with him, Mom. She was with Artie. The world went silent. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. She turned slowly to look at her eldest son, the one who had vanished for 5 years, the one who had arrived today with proof of Julian's crimes, the one who had led her directly to the files in the basement. Artie didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, the blue folder gripped in his hand. He was staring at the photo in Artie's hand. That's not Dad's daughter. Margaret turned to her youngest son. What do you mean? I saw that girl once, Julian stammered, his bravado completely extinguished. 4 years ago, at a hotel in Geneva. I thought she was a cousin or something. But she wasn't with Dad. He was already gone. Who was she with, Julian? Margaret moved toward him. her shadow long and sharp in the twilight. "Tell me the truth for once in your miserable life." Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the charcoal-grey SUV Artie had driven up in. She was with him, Mum. She was with Artie. The world went silent. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. She turned slowly to look at her eldest son, the one who had vanished for 5 years, the one who had arrived today with proof of Julian's crimes, the one who had led her directly to the files in the basement. Artie didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, the blue folder gripped in his hand. The flannel shirt, working man persona seemed to peel away, revealing the same cold, calculating steel that had made Arthur Sr. a billionaire. "Artie," Margaret whispered. "I had to protect her, Mom," Artie said, his voice no longer trembling. It was flat, professional, and utterly devoid of the warmth he'd shown an hour ago. "Dad told me about Elena on his deathbed. He made me swear to keep the foundation running to fund her treatments. She has a degenerative heart condition. If the money stops, she dies." "And Julian?" Margaret asked. "Julian found out," Artie said, casting a look of pure loathing at his brother. "He started blackmailing the trust. He said if I didn't let him borrow for his startups, he'd tell you everything. He'd blow the whistle on the offshore accounts and ruin Dad's reputation. I wasn't laundering money for myself, Mother. I was laundering it to keep your perfect memory of your husband alive and to keep a 10-year-old girl breathing." "By stealing from me?" Margaret asked. "By letting me live a lie for 5 years?" "You liked the lie," Artie said, a sharp edge of resentment cutting through. "You liked being the matriarch of Shoreline Drive. If I'd told you, you would have divorced a dead man and sold everything. Elena would be a casualty of your pride." Agent Vance stepped forward, her hand on her holster. "Arthur Miller Jr., you are under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and misappropriation of charitable funds." As the officers moved toward Artie, he didn't run. He looked at Margaret and handed her a small encrypted key fob from his pocket. "The frozen accounts aren't the problem, Mum," Artie said as they turned him around to cuff him. "The problem is the kill switch Dad built into the estate. Now that the feds are on the property, the Zurich Bank is going to trigger an automatic liquidation of every asset we own. In 60 minutes, the Shrew won't just be homeless. You'll be a debtor to the Swiss government for $100 million. The wind picked up, whistling through the eaves of the great house. Margaret looked at the key fob, then at the 2 sons she had raised, one a thief, one a ghostwriter of a dead man's sins. 60 minutes, Margaret said, her voice regaining its terrifying crystalline edge. She turned to Agent Vance. "I need a secure line to Zurich. And, Detective, get my daughter-in-law out of that car. If we're going to burn this empire down to save a little girl, the Shrew is going to need someone who knows how to lie better than any of us." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in a bruised purple light. The front lawn of Shoreline Drive had become a battlefield of conflicting jurisdictions, local police, federal agents, and the cold, invisible hand of Swiss banking. "Unlock her," Margaret commanded, pointing a trembling but resolute finger at the cruiser holding Chloe. "Mrs. Miller, she's a person of interest in a federal—" Agent Vance began, but Margaret cut her off with a look that could have curdled cream. "She is the only one who knows the contact protocols for the sister in Switzerland," Margaret snapped. "My sons are useless. One is a coward and the other is a martyr for a ghost. If you want your big fish in Zurich, you need me. And I need her." Vance hesitated, then nodded to the officer. A moment later, Chloe stood on the gravel rubbing her chafed wrists. The smugness was gone, replaced by a raw, feral twitchiness. She looked at Margaret not as a daughter-in-law, but as a co-conspirator in a house on fire. "The kill switch isn't just a liquidation," Chloe whispered, her voice gravelly. "It's a scorched earth protocol. It wipes the servers, zeroes the accounts, and triggers a suspicious activity report to Interpol on every name attached to the trust. That includes you, Margaret. You'll be on a no-fly list before dinner." Then stop talking and start typing, Margaret said, ushering them back into the house. The foyer was a wreck of discarded papers and heavy boots. Margaret led them not to the study but to the kitchen. She cleared the rosemary lamb, now a cold, greasy monument, to her failed Mother's Day, off the island to make room for Vance's government laptop and the encrypted key fob Artie had surrendered. "We have 42 minutes, Vance announced, her fingers flying across the keys. "The Zurich server is pinging the house network. It's looking for a biometric confirmation that Arthur Sr. is still alive. Artie must have been spoofing it for years." "He used a high-res scan of Dad's iris and a voice synth," Julian shouted from the hallway, where he sat on the floor guarded by an officer. "He kept the files in a hidden partition on the guest house Wi-Fi." Margaret felt a wave of nausea. Her life hadn't just been a lie. It had been a digital puppet show. She looked at Chloe. "You have the sister's number. Call her. Tell her to get Eleanor to the American consulate in Bern." "He kept the files in a hidden partition on the guest house Wi-Fi." Margaret felt a wave of nausea. Her life hadn't just been a lie. It had been a digital puppet show. She looked at Chloe. "You have the sister's number. Call her. Tell her to get Eleanor to the American consulate in Bern. If the accounts zero out, her medical bill payments stop instantly. They'll pull her off the machines." Chloe pulled a burner phone from her silk bra, a final secret she'd managed to keep hidden. Her hands shook as she dialed. "Maya, it's me. Don't speak. Just listen. The dragon is awake. You need to move the girl. Now." As Chloe barked instructions in frantic bursts, Margaret stood over Agent Vance. The screen was a blur of red lines and descending percentages. Liquidation progress, 18%, 19%. "I can't bypass the encryption without the physical voice key," Vance muttered, sweat beading on her forehead. "It needs a phrase, something only Arthur would say, something Artie would have recorded." Margaret closed her eyes. She reached back into the vault of her memory, past the bitterness of the morning, past the betrayal of the afternoon, to the man she had actually known. What was the one thing Arthur said every time he closed a deal? Every time he locked the safe for the night? "The ledger is balanced," Margaret whispered. "What?" Vance asked. "That was his catchphrase," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. "Every night for 40 years. "The ledger is balanced, Maggie. We can sleep now." Vance pulled up the voice synthesis software Artie had left behind. "If I can find those phonemes in the recorded archives—" "Wait," Chloe said, hanging up the phone and stepping forward. "It's not just the phrase. The Swiss bank requires a secondary authorization from the spouse. They've been sending automated emails to your old AOL account for years, Margaret. The one you never check because you hate the interface." Margaret felt a stinging irony. Her refusal to adapt to the digital age had been the very thing that allowed her sons to bypass her. She grabbed the laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys. She logged into the ancient account. The inbox was a graveyard of Arthur's ghosts. Thousands of notifications, authorizations, and personal notes from her dead husband that had been written by her eldest son. She found the one from 5 minutes ago. Urgent. Confirmation of asset liquidation. "If I click cancel, what happens?" Margaret asked. "The system will demand a live video feed," Vance warned. "It'll see you aren't Arthur. It'll trigger the fraud alert, and the house will be seized instantly." "Unless," Margaret said, looking at the silver platter on the counter, "it doesn't see a person at all. It just sees a shrew." Margaret grabbed a heavy, ornate candle snuffer from the counter and smashed the overhead light in the kitchen. The room plunged into shadows, lit only by the blue glare of the laptop. She pulled her hair down from its tight bun, letting the grey-streaked locks fall wildly around her face. She looked like a spectre, a hag, a woman who had lost everything and gained a terrifying kind of nothing. "Vance, patch the voice synth through the laptop's mic," Margaret commanded. "Chloe, hold the light from your phone, low from the chin up. Make me look like a nightmare." The video call connected. A chime echoed through the quiet kitchen. On the screen, a sterile office in Zurich appeared. A man in a suit looked into the camera, squinting at the dark, grainy image of Margaret. "Identification, bitte," the man said. "This is Margaret Miller," she said, her own voice steady, while Vance's software hummed in the background, ready to overlay Arthur's baritone. "My husband is indisposed. We are cancelling the liquidation. The ledger—" She paused, looking directly into the camera, projecting every ounce of the shrewish authority she had been accused of all day. "Is balanced," the software chirped. The man in Zurich paused, checking his monitors. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. "Confirmed, Frau Miller," the man said. "The protocol is deactivated. Have a pleasant evening." The screen went black. Liquidation progress. Aborted. Margaret collapsed back against the counter, the candle snuffer falling from her hand. The silence that followed was broken only by Chloe's heavy breathing. "We saved her," Chloe whispered. "Elena is at the consulate." "You saved a girl," Margaret said, looking at Chloe with a coldness that made the younger woman flinch. "But you didn't save yourself. Agent Vance." Vance stood up, closing her laptop with a definitive snap. "The fraud is still on the books, Mrs. Miller. The embezzlement, the money laundering, it doesn't go away because you stopped the clock. Julian and Artie are going to prison. And Chloe, well, the SEC is going to have a very long conversation with her about consulting fees." "And the house?" Margaret asked. Vance looked around the darkened kitchen, at the broken glass and the cold lamb. "The house is a crime scene. It'll be tied up in litigation for a decade. You can't stay here, Margaret." Margaret stood up, smoothing her skirt. She walked to the dining room, picked up her purse, and took one last look at the gilded cage. She felt lighter than she had in 40 years. The money was gone, the husband was a myth, and her sons were strangers. "That's fine," Margaret said, walking toward the front door without looking back. "I never liked the rosemary in this house anyway. It always smelled like something was hiding." As she stepped out onto the porch, she saw a taxi waiting at the end of the driveway, one she had called while Vance was hacking the server. She didn't look at Julian as he was loaded into a transport van. She didn't look at Artie. She got into the cab. "Where to, Mom?" the driver asked. Margaret looked at the encrypted key fob in her hand. The one Artie hadn't realised contained a secondary private account Arthur Sr. had set up for her, and her alone, hidden even from the Swiss kill switch. "The airport," Margaret said. "I have a granddaughter in Switzerland I've never met, and I think it's time she learned exactly what kind of shrew her grandmother really is." The Swiss air was nothing like the heavy, salt-laden humidity of Shoreline Drive. Here, in the high altitudes of Bern, the air was thin, sharp, and tasted of snow. It was an honest climate. Margaret sat on a wrought-iron bench in the consulate's private courtyard, draped in a coat of charcoal wool that she had bought with the last of the cash in her travel purse. Beside her sat a small, pale girl with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were so much like Arthur's it made Margaret's lungs ache. Elena didn't speak English well, and Margaret's German was 40 years out of practice, but they sat in a comfortable, quiet understanding. The girl was holding a stuffed rabbit, a gift Margaret had picked up at the airport, and tracing the embroidery on Margaret's sleeve. "You are Grossmutter?" the girl asked, her voice a fragile reed. "I am," Margaret said, her voice softer than it had been in decades. "And I am very, very sorry I took so long to get here." The legal storm back in the States was still raging. Julian was facing 10 years, Artie perhaps more, given his role in the digital identity theft. Chloe had turned state's evidence, trading her testimony for a suspended sentence and a lifetime ban from the financial sector. A fitting end for a woman who lived for the brand. The house on Shoreline Drive was boarded up, a hollow monument to a family that had built their foundation on sand. But Margaret didn't care about the house. She reached into her bag and pulled out the encrypted key fob. She had spent the flight over accessing the hidden account Arthur had left for her. It wasn't billions, it wasn't even millions. It was a modest, untouchable sum. Enough for a small cottage in the Alps, a world-class education for a girl who deserved a future, and a quiet life far away from the maternal galas and the suffocating weight of an empire. Arthur had been a liar, yes. He had been unfaithful, and he had been weak. But in that one hidden account, labelled simply, "For Maggie's Peace," he had acknowledged the truth. She was the only one strong enough to handle the wreckage he would eventually leave behind. "Papa?" Elena asked, looking at the gate as a doctor walked by. Margaret took the girl's hand. "Papa is gone, Elena, but the shrew is here." Margaret smiled, and for the first time, the word didn't feel like an insult. It felt like armor. It felt like a title she had earned. She stood up, tucked the girl's hand into hers, and began to walk toward the clinic's exit. The ledger was finally truly balanced. That was a wild journey from a high-stakes Mother's Day brunch to an international financial standoff. "Papa is gone, Elena, but the shrew is here." Margaret smiled, and for the first time the word didn't feel like an insult. It felt like armor. It felt like a title she had earned. She stood up, tucked the girl's hand into hers, and began to walk toward the clinic's exit. The ledger was finally, truly balanced. That was a wild journey from a high-stakes Mother's Day brunch to an international financial standoff. Now that Margaret has balanced the scales and started her new life, it's time to hear from you. What was the best part of the story for you? Was it the satisfying moment Margaret cut off the allowance in the study? The heart-pounding twist when Arthur Jr. arrived with the secret photos? Or the final transformation of Margaret from a shrew into a powerful, independent protector? Drop a comment below and let me know your favourite moment. If you enjoyed this long-form narrative, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Your support is what motivates me to keep writing and publishing these intense, twist-filled stories. Let me know what kind of story you want to see next.